Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk Cousins, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'll be talking about my tight end and quarterback rankings for Week 2 of the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'll be mentioning my top 16 ranked players at both the quarterback and tight end positions, giving you guys my thought process and opinions, while also presenting statistics that justify these players' current rankings going into Week 2. Tonight, we have the game between the Minnesota Vikings and Philadelphia Eagles. I've mentioned both quarterbacks and tight ends over the course of today's video, so if you guys are looking for specific players, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. Be sure to check out the timestamps down there. Of course, additionally, while you're down there, if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So timestamps are down there for those of you who are interested. Of course, we're going to also talk about matchups at both the quarterback and tight end position in order to identify the most advantageous positions for these players going into the given week. Final thing I wanted to mention before we talk about matchups, rankings, and all of that, for those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to do yourself a favor, travel over to Underdog Fantasy, link down in the description. When you go ahead and sign up today using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match, you're also going to get my rankings for the entirety of the 2023 season every single Sunday morning sent from my email directly to yours. Those rankings are by position, by tier, expansive rankings that you do not find on the channel on a weekly basis, includes flex, half PPR, full PPR, everything that you could require in order to set yourself up for success. So if you guys are interested, be sure to go ahead, check out the link down in the description. For those of you wondering if you're eligible, the map to the right side of the screen determines your eligibility. Play the pick'ems games, draft some teams responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much for the support. All right, let's talk about matchups going into Week 2, specifically beginning with the tight end position. I've gone ahead and collected statistics in regards to receiving statistics allowed to opposing tight ends thus far this season based on Week 1's performances. Of course, the Philadelphia Eagles, they gave up their fair share of points, not only to Hunter Henry, but Mike Gesicki. That bodes very well for the potential of TJ Hockenson, who's coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets and 8 receptions. We'll talk about it more expansively as we continue, but the primary reason I show you guys these statistics is because we want to take advantage of these opportunities. Nakobe Dean, one of their better linebackers in terms of coverage for this team, is going to be out. James Bradbury is going to be out. One of their starting safeties, Blankenship, is going to be out. This bodes very well for the potential of TJ Hockenson having a massive week on Thursday Night Football. Nonetheless, all these other teams, they give up their fair share of points to opposing tight ends. Obviously, touchdowns are going to skew this overall statistic, but when we talk about the other end of the spectrum, teams that were really good in terms of stopping opposing tight ends in Week 1, even though it's only 1 week of overall statistics, it kind of gives us a little bit of a glimpse. The New Orleans Saints and New England Patriots in the past have always been very good in terms of stopping opposing tight ends. So have the Buffalo Bills. This is not just a new thing. In 2022, there were weekly matchups that we typically wanted to avoid based on their overall personnel and defensive priorities in terms of stopping opposing tight ends. So at this current moment in time, we'll still keep an eye on those matchups. As of this week, Hayden Hurst probably has the toughest matchup on hand. Going up against guys like Demario Davis, they are really good in terms of covering the tight end position. There's a reason why Chigoziem Okonkwo didn't have any work last week. Nonetheless, just going ahead, presenting the statistics, let's get into our top 16 tight end rankings for Week 2, beginning with Travis Kelce as our number 1. I saw Travis Kelce jumping around yesterday at practice, celebrating with Chris Jones, the all-pro defensive tackle of the Kansas City Chiefs, is back in the building and on the practice field. So Travis Kelce looks like he's going to be healthy. Obviously, he still has a brace on that knee. Nonetheless, the fact of the matter is, in his absence, we saw Noah Gray and Blake Bell both combined for 8 targets, 5 receptions, 43 yards, a receiving touchdown, and 12.8 fantasy points. That is a bad week for Travis Kelce. And if he had participated in that Detroit Lions game, he would have been significantly better than our overall performance. Nonetheless, this offense is going to be elevated with his return. They take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. They had a privilege of doing that twice last season, once in the regular season, one in the postseason. In those games, 17.1 fantasy points, and in the playoff game, 28.8 fantasy points, 14 catches on 17 targets, 2 receiving touchdowns. We know that Travis Kelce is an elevated player in the playoffs, but nonetheless, he's obviously our number 1 in a great matchup. Number 2 is TJ Hockenson. Like I was mentioning before, James Bradbury, Nakobe Dean, and Reed Blankenship are all going to be out. That's a starting cornerback, safety, and linebacker for this defense. On a short week, I do expect to see a lot of utilization of TJ Hockenson. Besides the fact that he gets a high total of overall targets, I mean, we're talking about a tight end that since joining the Minnesota Vikings has had 8 or more targets in 9 out of the last 12 games he has participated in with the Vikings. That is an incredible statistic. And even though last week he wasn't able to total much yardage, only 35 receiving yards on those 8 overall receptions, opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And we're hoping for obviously the most advantageous matchup going into the week to present a lot of opportunity for TJ Hockenson to have an upside performance. Moving on to Mark Andrews, our number 3. The assumption is that Mark Andrews will hopefully get a full practice in by Friday, and if in fact that's going to be the case, he'll continue to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense going forward. And of course, we did see Isaiah Likely and Charlie Kolar try to kind of fill in for what exactly Mark Andrews presents. They combined for 2 targets, 1 reception, and 4 receiving yards for 0.9 fantasy points within that given week. Extremely underwhelming to say the very least, but the entire offense as a whole and Lamar Jackson really didn't do much. It was more of a running attack, primarily because all 3 of the touchdowns that they scored as an offense were all on the ground. So it certainly hurt everyone's fantasy upside. Nonetheless, Mark Andrews going into the matchup against Cincinnati. Last season, he had a privilege of taking them on twice. Once in week 5, had 10 targets, 8 receptions, 89 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 18.9 fantasy points. And in the wild card game, 10 targets, 5 catches, 73, 9.8 fantasy points. We know that he can take advantage of the opportunity on hand. Last week, the Cincinnati Bengals defense gave up 5 catches, 41, and a touchdown to opposing tight ends from Cleveland. I'm expecting success from Mark Andrews. Number 4 is Darren Waller. Hopefully, Darren Waller is going to be healthy because, man, all the questions that we had last Sunday morning in regards to is Darren Waller going to play, all for that terrible performance of this team getting blown out 40-0. They're obviously going to have themselves a bounce back performance going up against the Arizona Cardinals defense. The Arizona Cardinals, of course, they put up a fight against the Washington Commanders. So I expect another fight here against a team like the New York Giants. Nonetheless, Darren Waller is the number 1 receiving option in this offense. That's the expectation. And as long as we're going to continue to see him get a high variety of targets, his receiving upside and his utilization in the red zone will be apparent. We're hoping for that upside to immediately hit here in week 2, so we don't have to go ahead and continue to speculate as to how they're going to utilize him for the remainder of the season. Obviously, last week, the Arizona Cardinals, they gave up 5 catches, 60 receiving yards on 10 total targets to opposing tight ends. We're just hoping that throughout the film, Brian Daboll is going to scheme something up for Darren Waller to succeed this week. Moving on to George Kittle, another one of these players that has injured last week. I mean, we didn't find much success at the tight end position as a whole. In a half PPR scoring format, there were only 2 tight ends that scored more than 10 fantasy points last week. So that just kind of gives you an understanding as to just how terrible the position was as a whole. Nonetheless, George Kittle, he takes on the LA Rams. Typically in his entire career, he has posted incredible games, not only against the Rams, but against the entire NFC West that are division rivals, whether it's Rams, Seahawks, and or Arizona Cardinals. George Kittle has an opportunity with the 49ers, again, a team that has been undefeated in the regular season, taking on the Rams since 2019, 8-0, to have himself a pretty good week here. Obviously, there's a lot of mouths to feed. Deebo Samuel has himself huge games. Brandon Ayuk is on a hot streak. Christian McCaffrey's always going to get his. And George Kittle may at times be an afterthought, but considering his touchdown upside and the opportunities he's been given with Brock Purdy under center, I expect George Kittle to have himself a big week. Week 8 of last season, 2022, had himself 11.4 fantasy points, 39 receiving yards, 3 catches, and a receiving touchdown against the LA Rams, hoping for something similar. Moving on to number 6, Dallas Goedert. So he plays tonight. I expect Dallas Goedert to get back on track. Again, scoring 0 fantasy points, 0 receptions on 1 target was more of a product of the system going up against Bill Belichick's defense. Really shut him down. We all know that Nick Sirianni after the game not only said, hey, I need to get DeAndre Swift the ball more, I also need to get Dallas Goedert the ball more. The more opportunities he gets, the better our team is. And that's a fact. You go back to last season, weeks 1 through 10, prior to Dallas Goedert's injury against the Washington Commanders, the guy in the first 9 games of the season was averaging 10.2 fantasy points per game and was the number 5 overall tight end throughout that span of time. I'm expecting success. Last season in this identical matchup, taking on the Minnesota Vikings in week 2, we saw Dallas Goedert 6 targets, 5 catches, 82 yards, over 10 fantasy points. That's the hope. Number 7 is David Njoku. David Njoku played 73% of the offensive snaps, while Harrison Bryant played 36% and Jordan Akins played 31%. Overall, we know that this team loves to utilize their tight ends and have them in a lot of 13, 12 personnel, 11 personnel sets. Taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers is one of the best matchups of David Njoku's potential season every single year. Last year in the 2 games, 19.4 fantasy points, 12.2 fantasy points. Even if you go back to the 2021 season in which Cleveland Browns tight ends took on the Pittsburgh Steelers, they combined for 14.3 and 21.2. There's been so much of an effort from Kevin Stefanski to pick on the linebackers and safeties of the Pittsburgh Steelers and take advantage of this opportunity. I think David Njoku is going to have himself another big week here in the matchup. Number 8 is Evan Engram. Ran himself a fair amount of routes. I mean, obviously everyone ran more routes than a guy like Christian Kirk last week, but the fact of the matter is, Evan Engram getting himself utilization in a high-powered offense. They're going to continue to throw the ball, especially going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, who will have Chris Jones and Travis Kelce back. This should be a very competitive game. I mean, these 2 teams are pretty much kind of building a rivalry because they're seeing each other so often. I'm expecting Evan Engram to be a key part of this matchup, even though last season in the 2 games against the Kansas City Chiefs, only 2.9 and 5.6 fantasy points. I believe we can very easily find ourselves in a position similar to last week where Evan Engram catches the ball 4 to 5 times, 40 to 50 receiving yards, and is a solid play with the potential upside of getting himself more red zone work. Number 9 is Tyler Higbee. And even though Tyler Higbee was quite disappointing Puka Nacua really did, vulture every single total target. Matthew Stafford continued to look in his direction, and obviously they found success, so why not continue to go to that well? The question as of this week is going to be, can Puka Nacua do it once again? And if he's going to be the number one receiving option, now that the 49ers have tape on what exactly the Los Angeles Rams want to produce going into the given week, they may look to shut him down. And if that's going to be the case, the second alternative option within this offense, besides throwing the ball deep to someone like Tutu Atwell and or Van Jefferson, would be the mid-range potential option of Tyler Higbee. Last season with Matthew Stafford against the San Francisco 49ers, he had 14 targets, 10 receptions, 73 receiving yards, and 12.3 fantasy points. We're hoping for a huge game from Tyler Higbee, but nonetheless, he is going to be a secondary factor within this offense after Puka Nacua. Number 10 is Sam LaPorta. He had himself a promising rookie debut, 5 targets, 5 catches, 39 receiving yards. And even though for fantasy purposes, 6.4 fantasy points isn't great, but at the tight end position, quite frankly, that's an average week. So going into this week, we're hoping the matchup against the Seattle Seahawks is going to bode well. You go back to last season, TJ Hockenson in week 4 against the Seattle Seahawks. It was a shootout game. He scored 35.9 fantasy points. 8 receptions, 179, 2 receiving touchdowns. It was a shootout to say the very least. We're hoping for the Detroit Lions to go back to the well. Ben Johnson to continue to pull up schemes in which they utilized against the Seattle Seahawks early last season and continue to exploit those opportunities for the tight end position. Obviously, Sam LaPorta played 83% of the offensive snaps and was targeted on 20% of the total routes that he ran. Those are pretty strong numbers for week 1 at the rookie tight end position. Moving on. Number 11 is Kyle Pitts. So here's the issue with Kyle Pitts. Desmond Ridder plays quarterback for this team. Desmond Ridder was 15 of 18 passing, and unfortunately, Kyle Pitts only had 3 targets and 2 receptions, only 17% of the overall target share, while the running back position between Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier commanded 50% of the total target share. If, in fact, we get into a matchup against the Green Bay Packers in which Desmond Ridder is going to have to throw the ball even more because this team gets down early and they cannot rely upon running the ball late, Kyle Pitts will be more of a featured option within this offense. So will Drake London. Drake London obviously is going to have to deal with Jair Alexander, which pretty much keeps him out of my rankings going into the given week. Nonetheless, Kyle Pitts has a lot of opportunity. He just needs to be able to get himself a touchdown. I mean, that's really what his situation is, because he's never going to get away with a week of 10 targets, 8 receptions, 89 yards. I mean, I would love for that to be the case, but unfortunately in the offense that he's associated with, the upside's just not there for a high overall opportunity capacity. He's going to have to score touchdowns to be relevant. Number 12 is Cole Kmet. Now, speaking of scoring touchdowns to be relevant, Cole Kmet, despite not scoring a touchdown, 7 targets, 5 catches, 44 yards in a lackluster game for the Chicago Bears offense, to say the very least. They take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last week, of course, the tight ends of the Minnesota Vikings, they combined for 11 receptions, 67 receiving yards, and 12.2 fantasy points against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This has been a consistent factor over the course of the last couple seasons. Teams have picked on White and David on a consistent basis. Therefore, they've given up a fair share of stats. Nonetheless, Cole Kmet, as long as he's given opportunity, has the red zone prowess to continue to find himself opportunity there. Again, playing 97% of the offensive snaps gives Cole Kmet a lot more opportunity than a lot of other tight ends have within a given weekly basis. If those targets continue to stay consistent, he's a promising play. Moving on to Zach Ertz. Speaking of targets staying consistent, he came away from week 1 with 10 total targets, 6 catches, and 21 receiving yards, playing 77% of the offensive snaps, and quite frankly, one of his 2 overall red zone targets that he was able to haul in last week should have been a receiving touchdown if it wasn't for the fact that Josh Dobbs threw it 3 feet over his head. In my opinion, opportunity is king in fantasy football. And as long as Zach Ertz continues to see a high volume of opportunity and be the number 1 receiving option of this offense that should be throwing for majority of the game, he has value in my eyes. Moving on to our number 14, Hunter Henry. Another one of these players that had a pretty solid week 1. Again, 5 receptions on 6 targets, 56 receiving yards and a touchdown. Reminds me of the old Hunter Henry when he initially in the first season in which he joined the New England Patriots in Mac Jones' rookie year. So if you go back to 2021 and you look at the games in which Hunter Henry was participating in, he was either a touchdown or bust kind of player every single week. Very seldom did he ever have weeks where he was able to stay efficient with receptions and receiving yards. So we're hoping the matchup on hand against Miami. Again, Miami allowed 5 receptions, 42 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown to Chargers tight ends last season. We're hoping that Mac Jones, a potential new gunslinger within this offense, having set a career high in total passing attempts and passing completions last week, is hopefully going to be in a position to find Hunter Henry a lot throughout this entirety of the game. Again, last season, week 17 against the Miami Dolphins, 5 receptions, 52 receiving yards, 7.7 fantasy points against the Miami Dolphins with Mac Jones. If we can get a performance like that, I don't mind it, but touchdown upside is certainly needed for anything other than, a 6 or 7 point week. Moving on to Chigoziem Okonkwo. Now, Chigoziem Okonkwo had a unfortunate privilege of taking on the Saints defense last week. Now, the Saints have been really good in terms of stopping opposing tight ends. I was hoping that Chigoziem Okonkwo would see more utilization besides his 2 total targets, but considering the fact that Ryan Tannehill was 6 for 34 passing and had 3 interceptions passed, that's the worst game you're going to find from Ryan Tannehill. Therefore, going forward, I expect Chigoziem Okonkwo to get more utilization in terms of targets. The guy quite literally played 83% of the offensive snaps. He takes on the Chargers. I think this is an opportunity for him to get back on track within an offense that certainly needs another receiving option outside of D-Hop on a weekly basis. The final tight end I wanted to mention is Dalton Kincaid. Kincaid presents an opportunity going up against the Las Vegas Raiders where he could see himself an increased overall opportunity in terms of targets. Last week, Josh Allen throwing 3 interceptions, fumbling it once. I mean, that in itself siphons so much potential value for the fantasy purposes of all of the threats within this offense. Obviously, Stephon Diggs still had himself a great week, but James Cook, Gabe Davis, Dawson Knox, and Dalton Kincaid did not have themselves upside performances considering all those turnovers. Nonetheless, he played 80% of the offensive snaps. That is a great sign. And going up against the Raiders, who allowed 7 receptions for 56 receiving yards, primarily from Adam Trotman last week, I think Dalton Kincaid should have himself a great week. Okay, that's going to cover the tight end conversation. If you've managed to get this far in the video, be sure to click the like button, subscribe if you have not yet already. Again, we're making fantasy football content in order to help you guys every single week for the entirety of the season. Let's move on and talk about the quarterback position going into week 2. We begin with talking about matchups. Again, as you guys can see on screen, the Los Angeles Chargers, Philadelphia Eagles, Chicago Bears, they gave up their fair share of points to opposing quarterbacks in week 1. Now, what I went ahead and did in regards to the quarterback position is I'm isolating quarterback passing statistics because the matchups on hand do not dictate the potential rushing upside of a quarterback. Just because Derek Carr is playing a team that gives up a lot of rushing statistics to Daniel Jones doesn't mean that Derek Carr is going to take 5 or 6 opportunities to run the ball in the given matchup. It's just a matter of those quarterbacks having the ability and, of course, the willingness to run the ball regardless of what the matchup is on hand. Therefore, I go ahead and isolate passing statistics and find the following. Going into tonight's matchup, again, with 3 of the primary starting defenders of that defense out, there's an opportunity for Kirk Cousins on Thursday Night Football to make an impact. Of course, the Los Angeles Chargers, Ryan Tannehill is not someone that's going to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Justin Fields taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There are really only going to be a few matchups that you can see on the board here that you can take advantage of. Otherwise, just 1 week's of performances doesn't really give us much of an indication. Obviously, the Dallas Cowboys only allowing 0.4 fantasy points in week 1. Product of the system. You win 40-0. Daniel Jones completely just turns over the ball multiple times. It is what it is. We'll go ahead, have these statistics on screen and in mind. I'll refer back to them over the course of today's video, but we're not going to go ahead and put too much stock into the overall potential of these numbers. Let's go ahead and let's talk about our top 16 quarterback rankings for week 2, beginning with our number 1, Jalen Hurts. Playing tonight against the Minnesota Vikings, I have a lot of trust that potentially Jalen Hurts can get back on track. 12.5 fantasy points is extremely underwhelming, especially considering how incredible he was last season from weeks 1 through 15. Jalen Hurts was averaging over 26 fantasy points per game. So the idea of 12.5 fantasy points being a commonality within his overall scorelines over the course of the season, that's probably out of the realm of possibility. I think Jalen Hurts is far more capable of scoring fantasy points. The fact of the matter was, week 1, taking on Bill Belichick, it's a tough matchup. Now we go into week 2, taking on the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, when Baker Mayfield's able to have himself a great performance against that defense, that gives you a little bit of an indication as to what we can expect. Additionally, the Minnesota Vikings matchup is not new to him. Jalen Hurts took them on last season in week 2, Monday Night Football. 333 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 57 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 33 plus fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. There's going to be a lot of success here, especially considering the fact that in that matchup last season, he had an 84% passing completion percentage. He should be able to take advantage of the opportunity. With the Philadelphia Eagles backfield, of course, not being established, with Gainwell being out, DeAndre Swift, Rashad Penny, who is it going to be tonight? I expect a lot of the red zone rushing attempts to continue to go in the direction of Jalen Hurts, which only makes him more dependable for fantasy reasons. Moving on. Let's talk about our number 2, Patrick Mahomes. Even despite the fact that there was no Travis Kelce, he was one of the higher scoring quarterbacks last week with 19.5 fantasy points. Now, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, again, they're beginning to build some sort of a rivalry against them, considering how often they'll see them. But in that game, week 10 of last year, 330 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 39 rushing yards, 31.14 fantasy points. Again, the return of Kelce, such a huge difference maker in the potential of Patrick Mahomes every single week. It was apparent last week that he needed him in the lineup in comparison to all of the drops that he was getting from Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney. Patrick Mahomes back on track this week with Kelce returning. Moving on to Josh Allen, our number 3. Josh Allen had his worst performance since week 4 of 2019. Let's just put that into perspective. That was one of the worst games of his entire career in terms of fantasy purposes, scoring only 9.04 fantasy points. 3 interceptions, 1 fumble, and really didn't get much work on the ground in terms of getting himself into the red zone and usually scoring his typical rushing touchdown. As of this current moment in time, going against the Las Vegas Raiders, considering Russell Wilson's coming off of a week in which he had a 79% passing completion percentage and 2 passing touchdowns against the Las Vegas Raiders defense, Josh Allen should get back on track and have himself a fantastic performance in the given week. Number 4 is Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, again, played against the Indianapolis Colts last week. 240 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a solid week of 17.74 fantasy points. Now he takes on the Kansas City Chiefs. Last season, in the 2 games in which he took them on, 20.96, 13.28. The 13.28 fantasy point performance in the NFL playoffs. Obviously, it's a heightened level of competition. And a team like the Kansas City Chiefs, again, the defending champions, they rise to the level of opportunity in those games. Ultimately, Trevor Lawrence should have himself a pretty good game here. The addition of Calvin Ridley is obviously elevating this offense. I'm expecting this to be a shootout between these 2 teams. Number 5 is Justin Herbert. So here's the thing about Justin Herbert. Last season against the Tennessee Titans, not much success. Even though he threw the ball 40 plus times, 313 passing yards, unfortunately turned over the ball twice through the air. Hopefully we're going to see that kind of dissipate in this upcoming weekend's matchup, primarily because, again, Justin Herbert's going to have to be very successful in the passing game in order to win this game. The Tennessee Titans run-stop defense is incredible. And if, in fact, they're going to be missing Austin Eckler within the lineup, the receiving upside there is going to diminish, and it's going to be a matter of Justin Herbert being able to throw the ball down the field and making plays with his receiving options, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Josh Palmer, Quentin Johnston, and the plethora of tight ends that they continue to rotate. Now, last week's game, he was able to save his overall performance thanks to a rushing touchdown. This is something that we didn't see last season because he was dealing with that rib injury. Now that he's healthy, there's even more upside for Justin Herbert to run the ball more and get himself a higher capacity of fantasy points in an advantageous matchup throwing the ball against the Tennessee Titans. Moving on to Joe Burrow. Now, Joe Burrow, speaking of bad performances, 3.18 fantasy points last week, 82 passing yards, 14 of 31 passing, a 45% passing completion percentage. Awful. Now he has to take on the Baltimore Ravens, who may be missing 2 of their primary starting secondary members in Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Williams. So if, in fact, that's going to be the case, again, the last 3 times that Joe Burrow has taken on this defense, 17.28, 11.6, and 21.26. There is potential for Joe Burrow to find success, but it hasn't been since 2021 where Joe Burrow has really lit up this defense. Last season, his overall statistics, 217, 215, 209 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown in each of those 3 games. And the only reason he was able to get upside is because in 2 of those 3 games had himself a rushing touchdown. Ultimately, this is going to be a tough matchup, but we're hoping for Joe Burrow to have himself a bounce-back game coming off the worst performance of his career. We know what his worst looks like. Hopefully, we can get back to average, if not great. Number 7 is Lamar Jackson. On the other end of this overall competition between these division rivals, he takes on Cincinnati's defense. Last season, in Week 5 against Cincinnati, 14.76 fantasy points. Had himself a lackluster week, to say the very least. And in terms of overall statistics that he demonstrated within that game, very reminiscent of what exactly we saw against the Houston Texans last week. Again, even though Lamar Jackson was highly efficient, 17 of 22 passing, the fact of the matter is having 3 rushing touchdowns within the overall box score from your running backs, J.K. Dobbins and Justice Hill, certainly hurts Lamar Jackson. If, in fact, we can turn those into rushing touchdowns for him or even passing touchdowns, we know this is going to be a very effective offense. Ultimately, the competitive nature of this matchup should keep it a higher scoring event, and if that's going to be the case, Lamar Jackson should be able to step up to the task at hand. Number 8 is Tua Tagovailoa. Tua is 4-0 against Bill Belichick in his career. I don't know if there's another quarterback that can say that they're undefeated against Bill Belichick over multiple starts across a career. Nonetheless, Tua Tagovailoa is coming off a huge week. 466 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. I understand that you're very seldom going to see defensive coordinators allow their starting cornerback to play one-on-one man coverage with no help over the top from a safety against Tyreek Hill. Bill Belichick is not going to let that slide. That'll only happen to the Chargers because, I'm a fan of the Chargers, but guess what? The Chargers make mistakes like that all the time. That's just the Charger way, unfortunately. Now, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, the expectation is that Tua should be able to perform, hopefully win the game. It's just a matter of what kind of numbers are we going to see from his overall production. Last season, Week 1 against the New England Patriots, 14.8 fantasy points, 270 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown. Currently, via Underdog Fantasy, there is a 100K Sunday play in which you can go ahead, put Tua Tagovailoa within a pick'em slip. If you accurately get that pick'em slip correct, you have a chance of winning $10,000. 10 of you will have a chance of doing that for a 100K Sunday play event. So for those of you who are interested, of course, be sure to go ahead, use code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. Check it out today. His number is currently set at 277.5 total yards As long as he's able to get Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle in the mix, this offense should be able to do enough to maintain Tua Tagovailoa as a top 10 quarterback within the given week. Moving on to number 9, Justin Fields. Justin Fields, by all intents and purposes, can be considered to have had a bad game against the Green Bay Packers, right? Even though he had a 65% passing completion percentage, improvement from last year, even though he was able to get himself nearly 60 rushing yards, had himself a passing touchdown, over 200 passing yards, unfortunately, the turnovers that he had were the biggest difference maker. Ultimately, him having a bad game with 14.5 fantasy points, I mean, when you compare the bad game of his season to Joe Burrow, there's a huge glaring difference. All we really need is Justin Fields to get himself a little bit more rushing upside, or potentially just be more efficient and not turn over the ball, and we have ourselves a formula for automatic success. Again, we saw it last season. This was a guy from weeks 5 through 17 of last year, averaging 23.5 fantasy points per game. We're hoping that he's going to get back on track against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Again, at this point, Justin Fields is one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the league. Regardless of what he does through the air, there's always that single play that he can go ahead and run for 70 yards in a rushing touchdown, and none of us are going to be surprised, and he'll make his entire fantasy week off of a singular play. He's kind of like one of those high upside receivers like a Christian Watson. All you really need is one big play, and his whole week is set. Moving on to number 10, Anthony Richardson. Man, Anthony Richardson played incredibly. He was 24 of 37 passing, 65% passing completion percentage, 223 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 40 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown. Pretty much his numbers in terms of statistics was the kind of numbers that we were anticipating from Justin Fields in week 1, to be totally honest. 20.92 fantasy points. I want to give Shane Steichen a lot of props. The new head coach, offensive play caller of this organization, has really done a great job in terms of setting up Anthony Richardson for success. Primarily, if you go ahead and look at the next-gen stats, overall passing completions from last week's game against the Jacksonville Jaguars, you can tell that there is a very apparent overall, distribution of where the passes are going in the direction of. We know that Anthony Richardson loves to throw the ball to the right side of the screen. He doesn't really want to go ahead and throw across his body, even though the one pass that he threw to the left of him was a pass in which it went for 49 yards from Michael Pittman on a little bit of a bubble screen. Nonetheless, when you go ahead and just look at the distribution of opportunity on the right side of the field, we know where he wants to go with the ball. He wants to go to his comfort positions. And as long as they're continuing to move the ball down the field, he's getting his rushing upside. Taking on Houston this week, I have no problem with Anthony Richardson as a top 10 quarterback. Moving on to Daniel Jones. Again, Daniel Jones has got to play better than that. 104 passing yards, 2 interceptions, a 54% passing completion percentage, awful through the air. You got to remember, last season, Daniel Jones in the 16 games throughout the regular season, which he started, was averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. Now, luckily, he was able to get himself 43 rushing yards, but in terms of the overall matchups that we were talking about earlier, we isolate passing statistics, so it wasn't really taking that into account. Ultimately, Daniel Jones' rushing upside will continue to keep him in the conversation of being a relevant fantasy quarterback. Taking on Arizona in comparison to Dallas' defense is a huge difference maker, which should be able to get him back on track within the given week. Number 12 is Jared Goff. Last season against the Seattle Seahawks, week 4, 378 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 33.22 fantasy points within that overall contest. Seattle Seahawks just got diced up by Sean McVay, Matthew Stafford in that Rams offense. We're expecting Jared Goff to go ahead and dissect that film and do exactly what Matthew Stafford and Puka Nacua did to that defense with Amon-Ra St. Brown, which would be an even better overall combination. I think there's going to be a great opportunity on hand for Jared Goff to have himself another great week. Even though last week, 1 passing touchdown is relatively underwhelming, we know what he's capable of. He's a consistent quarterback that will be able to be fantasy relevant in our number 12 in the given week. Moving on to Brock Purdy, our number 13. Brock Purdy, again, besides the great matchup against the LA Rams, this team looks like they are out the gates hot. I mean, besides the fact that Brock Purdy had himself another consecutive game of 2 or more passing touchdowns in his career throughout the regular season, he is 8 of 8. Every single game, he has had himself 2 passing touchdowns minimum. Now, while we're on the topic of 8s, San Francisco 49ers, since 2019, they're 8-0 throughout the regular season against the LA Rams. Even Jimmy Garoppolo last season in week 8 against the LA Rams, 235 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns for 17.7 fantasy points. We're expecting that kind of a production, if not even better, from Brock Purdy in a division rival matchup. Moving on, we have Kirk Cousins, our number 14. Even though a lot of people want to look at the matchup from last year against the Philadelphia Eagles and think, well, Kirk Cousins is probably going to throw another 3 picks tonight. And hey, it's primetime Kirk Cousins. He's probably going to have himself a terrible game. When we look at the last 2 games in which Kirk Cousins has played on Thursday Night Football, 2022 against the New England Patriots, 299 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. You go back to 2021 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 216 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Even though he has turned over the ball at a frequent enough rate to where it does hurt him for fantasy purposes, considering James Bradbury, Nakobe Dean, And of course, Blankenship is going to be out for that defense. A lot of primary coverage players. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for Kirk Cousins to sit back in the pocket and throw the ball because they're not going to be able to find success running the ball considering their center's probably out and there's a chance that their left tackle is going to be out. And if that's going to be the case, he's going to have to get the ball out of his hands quickly and often in order to find some success. I have him as my number 14 accordingly. Moving on. Number 15 is Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson was able to save his overall week thanks to a quarterback power in the red zone that led to a rushing touchdown. Ended the week with 45 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 20.66 fantasy points. Unfortunately, the weather did play a factor last week, and that certainly made a difference on his overall passing completion percentage of 16 of 25. Only 55% is not great. That is very reminiscent of last season, and what Deshaun Watson did last season was play terrible football overall. Nonetheless, in week 18 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, his probably only good game of his entire stretch last season after he kind of built some sort of experience with the team, a little bit more rapport, he was able to go for 230 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a 66% passing completion percentage, and 44 rushing yards with 17 plus fantasy points. We're hoping for another similar performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers on Monday night. The final player I wanted to mention is Geno Smith. I think Geno Smith should be able to have himself a bounce back week. Last week amongst all offenses, there were some teams that had the 4th preseason game curse, like the Cincinnati Bengals, right? They didn't look like they were playing week 1. They looked like they were playing the 4th week of the preseason. Geno Smith, they came out hot. They scored. And then unfortunately, they just fizzled out. From my perspective, it was weird watching them fall apart and unravel so quickly. The fact that Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, neither of them had a single reception in the second half, just speaks to just how terrible this offense was. I think they're going to go ahead and they're going to address all of that. They're going to take on the Detroit Lions this week. Last season, Geno Smith against the Detroit Lions, 320 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 49 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. 31.7 fantasy points, had a 77% passing completion percentage against that team last year. I mean, last season amongst all quarterbacks, Geno Smith had the highest passing completion percentage, 69.8%. Last week only had 62% passing completion percentage. Again, across the board, a terrible performance. We're going to let that roll off our backs, and we're going to hope that Geno Smith is going to get back on track with this incredible offense and all the weapons that he has surrounding him. All right, guys, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Enjoy tonight's game. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew. Make that first-time deposit. If you have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel. We'll be back tomorrow with some trade targets. We'll be also back Saturday with a live stream and, of course, a video in regards to matchups for week 2. We'll be back also for Sunday morning, 8 a.m., well, probably maybe 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, a 3-hour live stream before kickoff of week 2. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.